And welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur, talking today about freedom of the press and, freedom of speech in general, as well as Canada's tolerance of anti-Semitism. We're a tolerant country. I'm not sure that we need to be tolerant of things like anti-Semitism, but that seems to be on the increase in our nation. So I want to touch base on that here today as well. Today's guest was arrested recently while simply taking a video on a public sidewalk of a pro-Hamas rally in Toronto. He probably needs no introduction. Ezra Levant, he's an author, the host of the Ezra Levant Show, and of course, the founder of Rebel News, rebelnews.com. So thanks so much for being with us here today, Ezra.
Paul, it's great to see you again. And freedom of speech and freedom of the press and even freedom of thought is always under attack, especially here in Canada. So we always have to be vigilant. And I'm afraid that I was arrested last week for exercising my freedom of the press. And that can be daunting. I think most people would be afraid of being arrested. But in the end, it actually worked out, I think, for the better. We had a crisis of freedom of speech in Toronto, and we decided to go back the following week. And that's an interesting story of going back to the same place where I was arrested.
Yeah. Well, why don't we back up just for the sake of some viewers may not have caught what happened there in Toronto. Now, maybe just kind of pro-Hamas demonstration. Again, I understand this is probably not very far from where you live in Toronto, a Jewish neighborhood, right? And and you're basically there on a public sidewalk with you're a journalist, okay? So you've got your camera with you there, and you want to film some of the stuff. And some of the protesters seem to get upset at you. So where does it go from there? What happened?
Well, you're exactly right. So I live in a Jewish neighborhood of Toronto, and for some reason, the pro-Hamas supporters target this residential neighborhood. It's not like there's an embassy or a consulate or any political target there. They're being quite plain about it. They're meant to target individual Jews. And every Sunday they show up for a few hours. They have these huge, high-powered speakers where they shout anti-Semitic epithets. And I think it's an astonishing thing. It would be like burning a cross outside a black church or something.
Yeah.
I mean, just like the KKK were often masked to instill fear and to hide their identity, a lot of these pro-Hamas supporters are masked too. Anyways, 9 days ago, they went further than ever. They recreated a scene involving Yahya Sinwar, the now dead leader of Hamas. They had some chair, covered it in fake blood. They had some guy sitting in it like he was this terrorist leader. Like, that's super creepy to do on a public sidewalk in a Jewish neighborhood. It would be like reenacting Hitler's bunker or something. Super gross.
It's meant to rile people up, right? I mean, it's meant to stir things up. Yeah.
So I wanted to document that. I wanted to record a video of it. Like I say, I live in that neighborhood. So I went there and I told the police, I introduced myself and said what I was there to do. But they escorted me away from this thing. And they said that, and I said, look, I want to do journalism. It's a public sidewalk. I'm a citizen. And yes, I'm Jewish. There shouldn't be a ban on me because the Hamas people don't like Jews. I have the right to be on the street as any Canadian does. And the cop actually said, your mere presence here alone is inciting them to breach the peace. And I said, hang on a second. I haven't done anything wrong. They're the ones you're worried about being violent. Arrest them. Anyway, I had a back and forth with these cops for a bit. And I think I said something that pricked one cop's ego. I said, you work for me. Because a cop said, I am the law. No, you're not. You're a servant of the law. You're an officer of the law. You're not the law. So I was arguing with these cops a bit. And one of them, I think, lost his patience with me. And he said, I'm arresting you for inciting breach of the peace. And they really did handcuff me right there on the street, marched me over to a police car, put me in the back of the police car, and took me to jail.
Yeah, I mean, part of me just goes, I mean, obviously you're not a danger. I mean, they use their discernment. Did they really have to handcuff you, period? I mean, I don't think that is necessary. It's probably overreach, but um, yeah, you know, just backing up just a hair here. I remember hearing part of the conversation, watching the video, and to be fair, I know the cop probably meant well in the sense that he's saying we're arresting you to protect you. We're doing this to keep the peace, and he probably genuinely believes that. I'm guessing. I mean. Maybe I'm just being generous, but
No,
I think
you're right. I mean, I'll go further. Let me make the police case for them.
okay,
They would say, if they were honest, we've got 20 pro-Hamas people here, some of them masked. They're reenacting a
yeah,
terrorist moment. And we have one Ezra Levant here with a camera.
yeah,
Who's easier to handle? The
yeah,
one guy who's clearly not here for a violent purpose, he's just filming, or the 20
yeah.
people,
It's
many of
easier,
whom are
right?
foreign citizens, like path of least resistance.
Yeah.
I get it. It's a lot easier to put me in cuffs. I didn't resist. I would never resist arrest. First of all, you're going to get beat up if you do. And second of all, I know the right way to handle a false arrest is in court later. So they took me out. But at that point, if you look at the video, I was actually pretty far removed from the Hamas display. There was a wall of cops there. I wasn't in any danger, but just the idea that you are inciting someone else to breach the peace by your mere presence. By the way, that's being dealt with by our Supreme Court in 2019. There was a case called Fleming versus Ontario. And let me tell you about it in 60 seconds. There was a guy named Fleming who went in Caledonia, which was a contested area. Some indigenous folks say that land is ours. Some
Right.
developers said, no, that land is ours. It was a bit of a ongoing battle politically.
Hmm.
A guy named Fleming went out there with a Canadian flag. And some counter protesters came, and the cops thought there was going to be a tussle. They're probably right. But they arrested the guy with the flag. And he sued them for false arrest and went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada in 2019. And they ruled unanimously, 9-0, that you cannot arrest someone who's doing nothing wrong because someone else might get violent. They were
Well,
crystal clear about it.
so this is a Supreme Court ruling. So the precedent has been set. In other words, yeah, if I'm hearing you right, the cops didn't have the right to arrest you to, keep the peace.
Exactly. I mean, the language they used was you were inciting a breach of the peace. First of all, I wasn't inciting anything. I
Right.
was at that point, I wasn't even talking to them. I was just surrounded by cops. Um, and filming on a public sidewalk is not incitement. If you listen to the whole video, you can hear a couple of the Hamas activists saying Jew, Jew,
Yeah.
Zionist.
Yeah.
So they, what was inciting them was the mere fact that I'm Jewish.
Yeah.
You should have the right to stand on a public sidewalk, no matter what your race or religion is, as long as you're not breaking the law. And I wasn't breaking the law. And the police admit I wasn't breaking the law because they eventually let me go without any charges, but not
Right.
before putting me in a jail cell for a couple hours. And so
So
what
again,
we did,
their mindset is, this is going to help just keep the peace, make sure no one gets hurt, and that's probably their motivation. But you're saying that isn't the law in Canada. So,
it's not the
so,
law,
so
and
you're
it's
gonna
not.
sue them, right?
Yes, I am, and it's not the law. And
Okay.
think about it from I suppose, a common sense point of view. If you are willing to arrest someone because someone else is threatening violence, well, the incentive structure you've just set up
Yeah.
is people should threaten violence and they'll get their way. If you can actually say to the cops, boy, I'm mad, I'm going to tune that guy up unless you move him. And if the police, instead of saying no violence from you, if the police go after the victim
Yeah.
for you, that's the opposite of what the police should do.
I
And I
think
understand
Canadians are
it's an
getting
easy way.
tired. I think we're getting tired of the wrong people getting arrested. It doesn't make sense.
Well, we've had a year-long crime wave in this country, especially in the big cities of Toronto and Montreal, where pro-Hamas extremists, many of whom are not even Canadian citizens, take to the streets and they're committing trespass, mischief, vandalism, uttering threats, assaults. We've had a year-long crime wave, and the police seem to turn the other cheek. Compare the
Yeah.
light touch police are taking with these many of them are foreign provocateurs, compared to how they cracked down on the peaceful truckers in 2022.
Yeah, that's a whole nother show, isn't it? Wow. Yeah,
I
you're
mean,
right,
but the
though.
peaceful truckers, they were peaceful. They
Yeah,
didn't threaten anyone. There was no violence.
yeah.
Didn't even get out of their trucks. They honked their horns, which was perhaps annoying, but they stopped when a court told them to. But Justin Trudeau invoked a form of martial law called the Emergencies Act that he didn't
Hmm.
even invoke during 9/11.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
deployed riot police. They seized bank accounts. That's how Trudeau and his various police forces cracked down on peaceful Canadian truckers worried about civil liberties. But you've had a
Okay.
year and 2 months of constant harassment and even crime, and the police have a double standard.
Yeah, there does seem to be some sort of a two-tiered system going on here, and it makes you wonder, why is that? I know there are some people who, are pondering, well, did our federal government, you know, communicate something to our police departments in Toronto and Montreal in particular, to take it easy on these guys? Now, is that tied in with votes, perhaps? There's an election coming up. I don't know. Your thoughts?
I think there's three things happening. First of all, like all government institutions, woke ideology has been
Hmm.
pumped into the police force. So they are trained to look at people as oppressors and the oppressed. So all of these Hamas people are now the oppressed, even though they've got nothing to do with Gaza. Many of them are just like they're just putting themselves in the position of the oppressed. No, you're in Canada. No one's oppressing you. You can't commit crimes and get out of it because of critical race theory. So, number one is wokeism. Number two, like I said before, it's a path of least resistance for the cops because they know I'm not going to be violent, but these folks might be. And
Hmm.
then number three is what you just mentioned. If you look at the demographics of Canada, Justin Trudeau, and to be fair, Stephen Harper before him, have brought in millions of people to our country who come from other lands where anti Semitism is endemic, where violence as a way of solving problems is acceptable. And we didn't screen for cultural fit. We haven't even tried to, we don't even talk about integrating, let alone assimilating people anymore. We've had
So this
such
is,
massive immigration. People live in their own ethnic enclaves. They don't speak
yeah.
English. They don't get inculcated into our Canadian values. And so when there's an anti Semitic moment, you bring in millions of people from overseas. Don't be surprised if thousands of them come to the rally as if you're in Gaza. This is Canada, though. This is not Gaza.
Yeah. So part of the problem that we're seeing here again with these massive anti-Semitic rallies, and again, not a lot of action being taken by the cops, has to do with our immigration system. You're suggesting here, right? So now Canada, we've always been a fairly welcoming country that way. Um, and that's a good thing. But I think, again, I'm seeing more and more polls indicating that the average Canadian is kind of backpedaling on that a little bit because we're saying we want immigrants, but we want to be a little more picky here. We want to make sure their values are similar to the values we hold dear here. We don't want people coming here who, think it's okay to, beat up your wife or whatever it might be, pick your poison. There's different things that happen in different cultures overseas that we don't want imported here. So how do we, I guess, sort through that? Any suggestions on that?
Well, I think there's a few issues. First is the raw numbers. I learned the other day there are now 4.9 million people in Canada on temporary visas who allegedly have to go home by the end of next year. That's more
Yeah,
than 10% of the population, 4.9 million. That's a staggering number.
it's
We
huge.
have 1 million foreign students in Canada. There's not even a million Canadian students. We have nearly a million temporary foreign workers driving down wages, driving up the cost of housing. If you have 4.9 million temporary people in your country, are you surprised that housing is the most expensive in history?
Yeah.
And then, so that's just the raw numbers. And then you have, like you say, we do not vet migrants for their cultural views. There aren't even in-person immigration meetings anymore. If you apply to come to Canada, you
Wow.
do not meet a human being. You do not meet an immigration officer. It's all done online or by paper.
Something's wrong with that, in my opinion. How do you make a qualified decision on something like that with not any interaction?
Well, we don't even. I mean, we have a sort of a point system for different things.
Yeah,
I don't know, have all the details in front of me, but you don't have a human interaction, and you're not vetted for cultural fit. And there are some Canadian values that are different than foreign values. And if you bring in people in a certain number, they can become acclimatized, they can be Canadianized. But if you bring in 4.9 million people with no
yeah,
connection to Canada, who live in, like, there are now cities in Canada where the majority of people are foreign migrants.
yeah.
And are we surprised that they don't inculcate Canadian values? It's shocking what we've done. And I think it'll be interesting what Donald Trump causes to happen, because he says he's going to engage in mass deportation.
Well, that's interesting. So what do we do here if we've got almost 5 million, folks who are immigrants on, visas that run out in a year or so? My understanding is the immigration minister, Mark Miller, he's expecting them to leave voluntarily. Now, I'm thinking if you're here from, Pakistan or, some other country that is, a lot different than it is here in Canada, you're going to want to stay here and not go back, just volunteering. And I don't think we have the manpower to hunt them down, do we?
And we're not even trying. And let me add a wrinkle to that. If Trump is going to deport millions of people, and he says he will, it'll be interesting to see what happens. If you are in the United States and you're worried that Trump's going to deport you, you could go along with it and be deported. You could try and
Mm,
hide in the United States, or maybe you just walk across the world's longest undefended border. And like you say, is Trudeau really going to kick you out? More than 100,000 people walked across Roxham Road, and the
yeah.
police who greeted them were like their concierges. They literally helped carry their suitcases across the border. Instead of 100,000, what if 1 million people came, and not just to Roxham Road, but everywhere from
Oh,
Vancouver to the East Coast? Because
okay.
there is no fence, there is no wall,
Yeah.
and most of it is not patrolled. And even if it were, Trudeau
Yeah.
does not kick people out.
Yeah. So, yeah, how is anything going to change? Well, it would seem evident that it's not going to be changing a whole lot. Now, some of these folks probably will go back, but again, percentage-wise, yeah, boy, 5 million people. So what happens then? I mean, I guess there's the thought that we cut off any government funding for these folks, and so they're going to have to find jobs under the table sort of thing. And I don't know, is there going to be a lot of that happening? You think?
Well, there's almost 1 million temporary foreign workers in Canada legally,
Yeah.
and they're brought here because big corporations like, I'll just give an example of Tim Hortons, prefer to hire people below minimum wage or below
Mm,
what they would have to pay Canadian workers. And to me, there's something immoral about
mm,
having hundreds of thousands of unemployed Canadian youth, but bringing in foreign workers to take those entry level jobs. And you know what? Tim Hortons doesn't need to save 25 cents per cup of coffee on the backs of young Canadians. If their profits are reduced by 25 cents a cup of coffee because they have to pay a little bit more for Canadians to work there, so be it. It's not an excuse for huge companies to basically outsource their jobs to a foreign country, but have the foreign workers here. I think it's immoral. We have a duty to Canadians first. I'm sympathetic to people from faraway lands, but not as sympathetic as I am to my own countrymen.
yeah.
Or it's like
Yeah.
you
For
love
sure.
your family and you love your
Yeah.
neighbors and you love your city and you love your country, but it's in that order.
Yeah, we got to take care of our own first. I would agree with that. Well, let's back up for a moment here. Back to the free speech issue here, Corn. Of course. So you went back the following Sunday, and there they are again, protesting again in this Jewish neighborhood. But this time you had some support with you. So how did that go?
That's right. So I was arrested a week and a half ago. So I thought, this can't stand. I cannot allow this to be the precedent in my own city, in my own country. I can't let that be the last word. So I emailed a ton of folks and I said, come stand with me. I think I was arrested in part because it was the easy way out. If there's 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 of us, it won't be as easy to arrest us, and it'll be a huge black eye to the Toronto police if they try. 20 million people watched videos of my arrest. And
Wow.
I think that embarrassed the Toronto Police Service. Well, imagine trying to arrest 50 people.
Yeah,
So on
that's
Sunday, it was incredible. People came from all over Ontario. People came from St. Catharines, from Burlington, from Hamilton. They drove from far away. Everyone wanted to make the point that Canadians own our streets, not Gazans, not Hamas
hmm.
activists. So I think there was about 100 of us.
Did you outnumber
And
the protesters or?
yes, absolutely,
Okay.
overwhelmingly. And so police did the right thing, either because they learned their lesson from the week before, or it simply was
Hmm.
logistically and politically impossible to arrest 100 of us. So we took back the streets. And I
I guess
called it
will
a
that the
90.
question is will that continue, and will it only happen when there's more counter protesters than there are protesters? You got to wonder where are the cops at in all of this and how they handle these things. By the way, you were interviewed by some foreign media outlets as well. I think Fox News. I'm not sure if there are other countries as well outside of the U.S., but how did that go? What was their response?
It breaks my heart every time there's a free speech crisis in Canada. There's far more interest in it in the United States than there is from Canadian media. I did two Canadian radio interviews. Ben Mulrooney, to his credit, had
Yeah.
me on his
Hmm.
radio show, and Mark Petroni. And I think that's it.
Oh.
Whereas I did Fox News and Newsmax and The Blaze and Glenn Beck Radio. And I don't have a list of all the foreign
Yeah.
media I did, but I think Americans really care about freedom of speech, even in other countries. There were some sympathetic reports in the newspaper, Joe Warmington of the Toronto Sun, and there was a couple of columns in the National Post. So I have to give them credit for
Okay.
that.
Good. Well, I'm
But
glad we're getting something, but there seems to be, again, mainstream media. You'd think they'd rise up and say, hey, this is a fellow journalist. We may not like him or whatever, but you know what? We need to stand up for each other here because, this is a precedent setting thing. You don't want to see more of this happening. We need to protect our freedom of press and freedom of speech.
and not just ordinary journalists, but there are groups in Canada that purport to represent all journalists: the Canadian
Mm.
Association of Journalists, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, Canadian Civil Liberties Association,
Yeah.
PEN Canada, Amnesty International. There's so many groups that claim to care about freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Not one of them put out so much as a tweet. I mean, that was the first time I'm arrested. It was a little bit shocking. My colleague David Menzies has been arrested 5 times this year
Yeah, I've
for
seen
the
that.
same thing every time.
He got some rough handling too in a few of those situations there. So I have to admire his tenacity. My hats off to David here. And again, I think maybe people sometimes argue, well, you know what? Okay, somebody like David, somebody like you're kind of, in your face kind of reporting, right? You don't shy away from things. But should that matter? I mean, you know what? It shouldn't matter. You just shouldn't get arrested for doing your job in a different style than the next media outlet down the road, right?
If David Menzies was in your personal house and he came right up into your face, you
Right.
could say, "Get out. This is
Sure. Of
trespass."
course.
But if David is in a public place like a sidewalk, and if he's covering someone in the public interest,
Yeah.
like a politician or like a public protest by Hamas, then that's legitimate journalism. And as long as David is not threatening anyone or assaulting anyone or touching anyone, it's allowed in Canada, even if people don't like his questions. And it's a bit rich for foreign provocateurs who support Hamas to claim they can be on our streets and they have the freedom to promote anti Semitism on our streets, but David doesn't have the right to report on it. And what's even worse is when the police seem to uphold that point of view. So some people can find David annoying. I find him charming. We can have differences of opinion on that. But it used to be that a lot more journalists asked assertive questions of public policy people in the public square. But these days,
Yeah.
I think a lot of journalism is a lot more vanilla. And it may
I
be because a lot of journalists get government subsidies. So that sort of
Boy, we could do
tames
a whole
them.
show on that. I mean, what was it, $600 million spent on that? And again, so you're right. I mean, so if you're a qualified media outlet, then you got this subsidy from the government, and somehow we're still going to be independent reporting when you're dependent on the people you're reporting on. Yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense, I think, to most Canadians. So yeah, I hope this doesn't continue this way. I mean, do you find do you feel like you're being targeted? Like it's just, right of center media outlets that seem to be getting arrested and so forth. Is this intentional?
Well, to be honest with you, I can't think of a single other journalist in Canada who's been arrested, let alone jailed.
Hmm.
I just can't think of one. If there's one I'm missing, please let me know.
Yeah.
Let alone David being arrested 5 times. And I think there's a pattern here because it's not just the police arresting David and me. It's, for example, Justin Trudeau and his hand-picked debates commission barring Rebel News journalists from covering the
Hmm.
2019 debates or the 2021
Yeah.
debates.
Yeah.
We had to go to court to get a court order forcing him to accredit us.
Yeah.
Or here's another example. Various cabinet ministers, Stephen Guilbeault, Karina Gould, Marcy Ian, Yara Sachs, all blocking Rebel News journalists on Twitter so we can't follow their departmental Twitter accounts, which is a source of information. Again, we had to go to court to get an order unblocking us.
Yeah,
So
something wrong with that. I'm running out of time here, Ezra. I'd like to maybe just to address our viewers here, because I think most Canadians are a little bit tired of this. What can we do, just as the average Joe, average Sue, to turn the pendulum on this back here? Like, how do we, maintain freedom to speak out and treat people fairly?
well, the first thing is for people to know there's a problem. And like I say, not all the media have reported on these arrests of journalists. So I think even just sharing the news is step one. Once people know what's going on, then they can maybe do something about it. So I would encourage people to write letters to the editor, call into radio talk shows, post about it on social media. And if they talk to their politicians during an election campaign, during a door knock, or even writing to them, saying that they're worried that our freedom of speech and freedom of the press is under attack.
So the average
Um,
person then needs to get off the couch and actually get involved. Maybe show up to some of these, rallies and so forth, and make a difference. Right? I got to leave it there, Ezra, because I'm out of time. But I need to have you on again. Thanks so much for what you're doing. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, and good luck to you, and all the best to your viewers.
All right, Ezra Levant, rebelnews.com. Thanks for watching. You can tell your friends about this too. Watch the podcast at WizeUp.ca or at app.corcoplus.com. If you have any comments, just email me, paul@WizeUp.ca. Thanks for watching.